All right, let's begin this morning with prayer. Thank you, Lord, for the opportunity to be together, to study your word, to think biblically about all things, that your name might be glorified in everything. We thank you for your providential plan, your Son's provision, and your Spirit's protection. Amen. So, this is one of those times when I have to say to you, there's so much to say, as there always is. I really encourage us to consider a few ideas here. One of them is actually to go back to our website where I am teaching two separate segments that might be very helpful in this regard as we discuss politics today. One of them is in the Wisdom series, which was 2 years ago, and then last year's series, week number 12, the Prophets. So if you're at all interested in catching up, actually the videos are there online. You can actually watch my teaching from those two sections. So Wisdom and Culture under the Wisdom heading, and then under the Old Testament heading, week 12, the Prophets. I would also encourage you to consider the Warp and Woof site, which is my personal website. I've been writing there for I don't know how many years now, but a lot of times. One of the sessions, one of the writings that blew up my analytics was what I wrote on politics. And I'm not going to be discussing any of those ideas today outside of the major idea of politics. So I might encourage you to go back to check that out, to see what I've written about politics in particular. It was interesting to many people. I'll just leave it there. Lots of books to consider. One of them I'm bringing forward today to us. This is academic to one degree or another, but I encourage the thoughtfulness of it. Seek the Welfare of the City is the title. This is Bruce Winter's book, Seek the Welfare of the City. And it's based on that famous line out of Jeremiah 29, which actually we're going to read today. But the ideas that come out of books really do influence people, and they influence people like me because I'm reading all the time. And I actually had a stack of books I was going to bring today, but I decided against it. So if you're really interested in more books, email me. Okay, my last name, 1957 at Gmail, and I'll send you a whole bibliography of so many books that you'll never get through. All right. So, I want you to know up front what some of my biases are. I think that's always appropriate. Here are my first two. I believe that all of life rests on two pillars. I believe in the authority that is absolute, which comes from God, and I believe in the inherent corruption of humanity. Those two ideas are the basis for everything that I think, everything that I teach. I believe they run through every single concept in human history, much less in our current understanding of things. So, absolute truth of God and the inherent corruption of humanity. So let's give some examples of what that actually looks like. I believe actually in the application of these things. So I believe in the absolute truth of statements like Amos. Seek good and not evil. Hate evil and love good. Amos 5 is really very much of a clarion call to how we ought to live life. And then there is this line from Jeremiah 29, and I wanted to read these verses for us so that we get a sense of the context. Jeremiah is writing God's words to the people who are in Babylonian exile, just to get the backdrop to this. And the idea here is that God is writing to the people and saying to them, look, while you're there 70 years in Babylon, this is what you're supposed to do. I'm reading now from Jeremiah 29, verses 4 and following. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all the exiles whom I have sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat their produce. Take wives and have sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there and do not decrease, but seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf. For in its welfare you will find your welfare. Now, that word welfare is mentioned 3 times in one verse. And that word is literally from the Hebrew word, which is shalom, which means peace. It means about 20 other things too, but nonetheless it means, how can you see the flourishing of the city? That's the emphasis here. So the universal application of absolute law from God's perspective is, there are certain things that are good for us to do all the time. So the emphasis always, as we've been discussing in this class as well as many other places, is to actually know and understand what good is. So there is also the flip side of this, namely that inherent corruption corrupts everything, including politics, and this from Mao Zedong. If you've never understood some Chinese history, it might be good to go back and read what was going on after the Second World War. There was a nationalistic versus communistic tug of war, as it were, and Mao won, and this is one of his famous statements. In fact, there was a little pamphlet when I was growing up in the 70s that actually gave the words of Jesus in comparison to the words of Mao, which is a really fascinating little book. But nonetheless, this was his view. So if you want to corrupt politics, this is a great way to corrupt politics. Just go out and blow people away, or put them in gulags, or torture them, or. Between Stalin and Mao Zedong, millions upon millions of people lost their lives because of inherent human corruption. So, I would also like to suggest that there are no guarantees in whatever we discuss concerning politics, or anything else for that matter. Namely because Jesus consistently said throughout his time on earth, and obviously throughout Scripture, that in this world you're going to have tribulation. There's not going to be any absolute answer to the problems and questions that face us in politics, education, business, money, all of the different areas that we've covered and will be covering in the future. So, while we apply them, we are always going to be unsatisfied with them, because the ultimate completion of this will not happen until Jesus returns. So, I thought you should know something else about my biases. We're still on my biases, by the way. One of the biases is that when I was a kid, when I was a teenager in 1972, I was actually helping a senatorial campaign in New York State, where I was born and raised, in 1972. And what I thought about, and this is where I encountered Francis Schaeffer during these years, and those of you who have heard me speak about these things in the past understand some of that background, but the bottom line was that I was watching this political campaign that I was invested in, and I was also invested in thinking theologically about everything. And so the bottom line for me was that I realized that if I get involved in politics, I'll be spraying water from the fire hose and the flames. But if I get involved in theology, I'll actually get to the coals and perhaps knock out the origin of the fire. Because, as a Christian, I believe in the inherent corruption of humanity, and what's the only solution to that is Jesus. And so the salvation that Jesus provides, it will be the solution. It will not be political gain in the overall scope of things. So, I wanted to make a few comments about hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is a big old word, simply means the study of interpretation. So how do you interpret stuff? So let's just say that everybody interprets everything, and oh, by the way, you're interpreting my words right now. They're going into your brain, and your brain is interpreting what you're hearing me say. So, I wanted to make sure that we understood the problem of our interpretation of certain things. So here's just one of them. Immigration is a constant concern, especially in the last couple of years, and maybe within the last month in particular, as we see folks moving from south to north. And this is one of those things that I think is really important for us to understand and apply. So here it is. From a national policy perspective, you cannot construct national policy going back to Leviticus 19 and Deuteronomy 10. These passages were meant for believing people. They were not meant for nation states. Okay, so how you treat the stranger, alien, and foreigner has nothing at all to do with United States policy toward immigration. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. You cannot apply those laws that were given to Israel and then think that automatically they apply to the United States of America. However, no matter the nation state, believers bear responsibility to act as Christians to the stranger, alien, and foreigner because of Leviticus 19 and Deuteronomy 10. So, let's say, for instance, that all the borders go down. From a U.S. American citizen perspective, worst case scenario, what's my responsibility? According to Scripture, my responsibility is to love the alien, the stranger. Don't matter, nation-state policy. So don't try to tell me that you're going to build laws based on Leviticus 19 and Deuteronomy 10 for nation states. But also don't tell me that you're not going to love the foreigner because of political perspectives. So, there is no such thing as a nation without borders. Some of these things are just so obvious, I think. I even kind of chuckled to myself having to say them out loud. But there's also no such thing as a Christian given to xenophobia. We are not to be afraid of the stranger. We are to welcome the stranger. So either we preserve what has been given, that is, this country, the laws, the freedoms, and so on that we have, and at the same time love our neighbor, or we don't. So we're responsible both for the preservation of what we've been given and the love of our neighbor. See, let me just pause here to say that I'm probably ticking off everybody in the room right now because you're all thinking, that's not quite the way I see things. Well, there you go. This is what happens, when you begin to think about these things. You begin to think biblical thoughts, but think about them from when the Bible was actually written and who it was written to. So here's our struggle. We bear responsibility to consider our place in history. There's never been another nation like this. Let's just say that out loud. Never in all of human history has there ever been a nation like this. So we've been given all of these things, rights and privileges and positions of authority in the world and so on. Never before in human history. So now, what's our responsibility? Well, according to Scripture, which is, go to the handout here, I've given you a multitude of statements about such things. I've given you a biblical philosophy of politics there toward the top, and I'm not going to read all of this. You can read this on your own. I've given you basic biblical foundations for all of what I'm suggesting here about natural law, political power, checks and balances, and so on. And then on the back side of the paper, my responsibility then in terms of attitudes and outcomes, and how I then am responsible for the life that I've been given. So I highly encourage you, as I do every week, to actually check out the handout. I'm not going to be going through every single thing that's there on the handout. Actually, we're going to pause for a moment in 1 Peter, but other than that, understand that the American uniqueness is a preservation that's been given to us. What will we do with that which has been given to us? Are we just going to allow it to go away? Or do we see our responsibility in keeping it as something that, for the rest of the world, everybody wants to come here? Not everybody, but a lot of people. So, let me give you an example of these universal principles. The recent Supreme Court brouhaha, I think I called it a debacle in social media, was not about liberal and conservative perspectives. It was all about something called originalism. That is, whether or not you actually believe that this document called the Constitution should be interpreted as it was originally given and the words understood from that perspective. And that is very different from the other perspective on the Constitution, which calls it a living, breathing document. So you have these justices on the Supreme Court. So you have folks like Kagan and Sotomayor, for instance, who are living, breathing document folks. And then you've got others on the other side who believe in the original documents. So the most recent folks who have been added to the Supreme Court, Kavanaugh and Gorsuch, for instance, are originalists. So you have a different point of view about this, and I wanted to make sure to at least say this, that when we talk about hermeneutics, we talk about the study of how do we understand things. Here's just an example of how this actually plays out in the culture in which we live. So, the interpretation is clear. What response do we have to the words that were meant then, to those people then, and what response to the words do we mean to us now? So, do we actually believe that the Bible, this book, that we read and study and teach and preach from, is an original document that we think is very important, that we understand how it was originally meant? The same applies to other documents. It doesn't matter what they might be. I was in a conversation with a individual just this week, 2 days ago actually, and I got done explaining my philosophy of what we were discussing, and he said to me, "You really are an idealist, aren't you?" And I said, "Yeah, I really am. Though my definition goes something like this: I'm an idealist who's been bludgeoned by the hammer blows of reality." So there's that. So let me knock down some other thoughts while I'm at it. America is not, nor was it ever conceived to be, a Christian nation. Just pause, let that hang in the air for a moment. This, by the way, my statement here is very different than Christian influence. Don't let anybody tell you that Christians didn't influence the origin or the establishment of this country. Nothing could be further from the truth. Folks don't know history if they don't understand the Christian influence of this nation. However, if you believe America is a Christian nation, then you need to apply direct Bible truths to national policy. Try using Leviticus, by the way, as the basis for national policy, and see how far that goes. The other, however, is that if you believe America is not a Christian nation, then you need to stop trying to apply direct biblical truths meant for Israel and the church to national policy. You can't have it both ways. So for those who think that this is not a Christian nation, then you need to quit applying biblical truths in your arguments about that point. You can't have it both ways, is what I'm suggesting. And that's the point about originalism. It's either this or that. You have this view or that view, but it doesn't work both ways. So, finally, after all of that preamble, what does the Bible have to say? Let's take a look. 1 Peter chapter 2. I'm going to begin reading in chapter 2 and verse 11 from the English Standard Version. As a comment here, this is a book written to a group of people that was scattered. In Greek, it was called the diaspora, and it meant that people were scattered everywhere. And this was this particular group. And this particular book is the book on Christian persecution. So if you want to understand how you should think differently as Christians within the concept of persecution, this is the book to go to. So here it is, 1 Peter 2:11. Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against the soul. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God in the day of visitation. Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme, or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor. If ever there was a verse dedicated to a modern-day meme, it's 1 Peter 2:17. I'll read it again. Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor. So, what does all that mean? Maintaining order in the Roman Empire was often under the boot of a dictator. Free speech was unheard of. The wrong words within the Roman hearing were justification for immediate imprisonment or worse. Usurpation of person or property was, at times, at the whim of government officials or common soldiers. Emperors often acted as if they were gods instead of men. So when you're reading 1 Peter chapter 2, my point is that you must read it within the context of this backdrop. Don't read it within the context of American backdrop because we have such titanic freedoms. These folks didn't have these freedoms. Now let me pause to make the point, if it's not been made already. If this was said to Christians under the hobnail boot of the Roman government, pause, wait for it, then how should we respond in a nation where we have all these freedoms? Should not we at least consider the same application? I mean, these people were under persecution. We are not. But these are the words given in 1 Peter. Now, I don't care which president you're talking about here. It doesn't matter. These words still apply. So, And if you, by the way, haven't figured out yet that I'm already in trouble with numerous people, here we are. Submission was required of the Christian no matter the authority, the created institution, or the office. Submission, wow. Peter explains our responsibility is to do good even if we think the authority to be foolish. Wow. I'm pausing here after each of those points just to let that sink in for a moment, okay? We should view our Christian submission to authority as a voluntary act, not governed by political party. And if means existed in Peter's day, this would be the one: fear God, love Christians, honor everyone, honor the emperor. This is it. So when in Rome. So let me just pause here and make another application. I want to warn everybody, parents, teachers, leaders of any kind. I'm going to preach now. Okay, about 20 seconds. Hang on. If you disrespect authority in your household, do not be surprised if your kids disrespect you. I have been a teacher for 36 years, and I have seen this constantly. That whole apple falling far from the tree thing. When I have parent-teacher conferences, I figure that out real quick. All right, I'm done now. So, to all the people who want to say, it's worse than it's ever been. Oh, come on. Read history. You know, this is something that's been going on since the founding. I mean, people were shooting each other in duels because they disagreed. It's not as bad as it's ever been. Just before the Civil War, a senator was beaten within an inch of his life on the Senate floor. Speaking about blood on the floor, there you go. We speak metaphorically of that now. That actually happened. So, it's not as bad as it is. Our problem is that we're not reading the same documents. We don't know America's history, good, bad, and ugly. We're not moved by the same speeches, writings, and stories. Instead, we're listening to commentators. We only travel in our tribes. We only read those with whom we agree. We attach ourselves to our labels and think no further than our nose. Just pausing to let that sink in. So, our emotive, vitriolic, bombastic, shrill, and profane diatribes splinter, fracture, divide, and fragment us. Our politics are so loudly partisan, so intensely personal that we cannot hear anybody else. Now, I hope you get the sense that that's probably somewhere that we're living right now. So what do I take away from all of this? Well, there was a guy in the First Testament, the name of Cyrus. He was king of Medo-Persia, and he was used actually by God. In fact, his name was Messiah. Messiah in Hebrew simply means one who is appointed to a task. Cyrus was used by God as a pagan, unbelieving person to allow Israel to go back to its own land. Wow. You mean pagan, unbelieving people can do good things according to God's providence? Yeah, how about that? Amazing. So, how do I live in a pagan world? Here's a bunch of guys. Maybe you've heard of them, maybe you haven't. I've really posted a lot of it in the past over the last weeks about Christian Institute, ChristianHistoryInstitute.org. Highly recommend you go back and check some of these out. These folks lived within 50 or 60 years of the disciples, the apostles. And they offered numerous statements throughout the first century about how Christians were to live in the world. And, oh, by the way, they sound very much like 1 Peter 2, 11 to 17. So, in Acts 22, for instance, when Paul was about to be beaten by the Roman centurion, he actually used his citizenship as a guard against being physically beaten. Don't you know you're about to be a Roman citizen? And then he had this opportunity in the next few chapters in the book of Acts to actually speak before the political powers of the day. So, I may not like you as a politician, but my responsibility is to respect the authorities given by God. Paul actually gives us a really good idea of how that ought to look in the book of Acts. So you may not like us, but remember what you do like about us. Now this is just kind of a brief commentary on Roman civilization. In the day, I just made a comment about this, there was such a thing as Roman peace or Pax Romana, where the Roman nation state encompassed all of that purple section on the map there. And these guys, Martyr, Tertullian, others, who were speaking out as Christian apologists, they were saying, look, you don't like us, you want to blame us for everything, including fires in Rome and such, but you don't realize how good you got it with folks like us, who continue to do good within the midst of you. So, in fact, you're the ones who leave your dying babies on our doorstep and we take care of them. Just don't forget that. This is all Ackles free translation. First century apologists, okay? Okay, so what did Jesus do? This is an important point, considering that, our Lord did this. When we think about the fact that he had 12 disciples, and 2 of them were literally on opposite sides of the political fence, think about the implications of this. You've got Simon the Zealot. Now, the Zealots, of course, were those guys who took the Sicarii. By the way, that's not just a movie, though the movies are interesting. But the Sicarii is an 8-inch blade that was used under the cover of cloak to kill Roman soldiers in the marketplace, between the 4th and 5th rib, I might add. So, the idea of Simon the Zealot joining Jesus' disciples, along with a tax collector who was working as a shill for Rome. I mean, you don't get any more diametrically opposed than this. And the same disciple group in the Bible. All right, so let's make some specific applications here. We have actually volunteer chaplains in our state house in the state of Indiana. Matt Barnes is one of them. We do our first broadcast of the radio show in January at the State House when everybody comes in on Wednesday. They have a capital prayer meeting every week during session. Now this is what Matt does, among many things. He's a chaplain, so he actually does pastoral work with legislators in the Senate and the House. And the stories he could tell. Oh. So he said, when I have a prayer meeting, we end by having a big circle, and everybody holds hands. And he said, it is an amazing thing to see a black woman progressive liberal hold hands with a white male conservative and pray at the same time, in the same room. Did I say holding hands? And then he told me, he said, among other things, he said, it's really, really hard for legislators when they have just been in prayer meeting, when they see me standing in the back of the Senate chamber to say bad things about the people they were just in prayer meeting with. Matt has a tremendous influence, and it's for good. It's for good. All right. I've mentioned Titanic freedoms. We have this idea that sometimes things will always be this way. It will not always be like this. I would suggest that all nations fall, and often from within. And the problem is not with political parties, but with individuals. So I would make sure to help us to understand that when we talk about nation states, just read history. They all fall from within, the greatest ones do. Educational systems and parental controls have much to do with this. If children are not taught why a nation is important, then why should they want to defend it? If we do not teach the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution of the United States, the great speeches of folks like Martin Luther King or Dwight David Eisenhower, or add to the list any number of other books, speeches, personas, we will not be living in the same nation. We will have our little groups that only listen to certain things and read certain books and never cross paths with anybody else. And that's our problem, not the politicians' problem. So, Our homeland is far from perfect. We have sinned in numerous ways, and I emphasize that as systemic sin. Slavery, forced relocation of Native Americans, abortion. Yet, in God's mercy, He has allowed a measure of providential success and prosperity to many. Americans have titanic freedoms envied by people in other nations. Hardships abound, yet citizens of the United States live in the most prosperous, peaceful country in human history. Our distinctive standing mandates our respective responsibilities. So going all the way back to the earliest teaching I've done in this class, when we have been given something, Genesis 1:28, Genesis 2:15, our responsibility is both to produce from it and to protect it. If we know there are problems and sins and issues that we need to overcome, our responsibility is to produce something about that. But we also bear the responsibility to preserve that which has been given, which is good. So it's imperative for all of us to remember that we live in a free country, protected by a strong military, which, by the way, I'm speaking on next week. Next week is on the military. Governed by laws where we are in agreement about basic ideals of life, liberty, and virtue. I could not write these words, nor could you publicly respond with your own views in places like China, Cuba, Saudi Arabia, or Russia. America is a great nation. Our politics should produce careful reflection. Pause to thank Jesus that you live. I do every day. I am grateful to live in this nation. So, this last week I was teaching at IUPUI and teaching about some of these ideas, though they were universals and not anything at all about politics. And I was trying to get my students to think about other organizations and groups, so they were looking up some of these, and one of them is called the Heterodox Academy. We speak a lot about, or use the word a lot in our culture, of diversity. Diversity has much more to do than with just simple ethnicity. It has to do with viewpoints and perspectives that other people hold. The Heterodox Academy is actually, there's a whole bunch of folks included in the list of people that support it, including yours truly, which is a group that says we need to listen to everybody, we need to read all of these different kinds of ideas, and we can come to different conclusions about them, but nonetheless we do this within the confines of freedom and also within the generosity that we should be offering to other people, to other perspectives. And this, remember I mentioned I was an idealist? Here's my idealism in a picture. This is what I wish for. The Obamas and the Bushes are dear friends. That's all I want to say about that. So, a couple weeks ago I was in Pennsylvania teaching a PhD course. Here are some of my students and folks from Zimbabwe, Kenya, and Uganda. And the African students were, they've been working very, very hard. Very difficult, obviously. We're talking about language barriers and difficulty even getting books in their hands sometimes. All kinds of issues. So about halfway through the course, I paused and they kind of let me know about how hard this was, and they didn't expect all this work and so on. And I let them talk about how they felt. And then they wanted to know what I thought about all of that. And this is what I said. People in Africa will respond to these young men who will set the stage for their continent for years to come. Now, this isn't just about a PhD. This isn't just about academics. This is about Christian leaders in countries and on a continent which is expanding in its influence. You do realize, don't you, that in the North and in the East and in the West, churches and Christian influence is shrinking. And you do realize, don't you, that in the South and in the East, it's expanding. In Africa, in Asia. There's actually churches in the United States that are under the authority of denominations in Uganda. Stop to ponder that for a moment. I'll say. So here are some thoughts. We need to encourage those who do good, no matter their viewpoints. You hear this from me all the time, Titus chapter 3. We need to lead with mercy, never trafficking in bile or vitriol. Ephesians 4 tells us pretty clearly. We need to be known for our love. Others seeing that we are Jesus' disciples. John 13 is pretty clear. We need to stand for right against wrong. And we do that by winning the respect of outsiders. And then we respect our authorities so that we might live our lives in peace, 1 Timothy 2 says. So, 5 police officers were murdered in Dallas a couple of years ago. And these are the words of then, not during that period of time, but before that time, former President Bush. Too often, we judge other groups by their worst examples, while judging ourselves by our best intentions. And this has strained our bonds of understanding and common purpose. But Americans, I think, have great advantage. To renew our unity, we only need to remember our values. We have never been held together by blood or background. We are bound by things of the Spirit, shared commitments to common ideals. George W. Bush is a believer, and that kind of comes through everything that he says and does. Don't have to agree with his policies and all of that during the time he was president. But do consider the ideals that we've suggested here today from places like Jeremiah 29, 1 Peter 2, and elsewhere. That we think about how we consider our political selves in light of the fact of our Christian selves. And the time that I've been dreading for all week. Are there any questions? I'm kidding.
A comment from the secretary was out of the effort. I actually have that on my computer before. But one of the things I was in ROTC, wasn't the whole military. What I remember being taught was that you salute the insignia. So you know, there's someone in the higher rank, you were saluting that rank. But that person has to earn individual respect. So you can have somebody in office that you don't respect personally, but you still honor that position and let them earn your respect as an individual. So that's how, you know, at least in the military, that was the idea of how that order was maintained, we honor the person.
It's an interesting perspective. Thank you. Other thoughts, comments, questions?
Mark, at the age of 16, where did you get your maturity for your theological caring to
Yeah.
where did that come from? Your parents?
No. No. I was born in what I refer to as a AAA household. My father was an abusive, adulterous alcoholic. Not from there, from Scripture. When I was saved at the age of 9, that was really quite the turning point. And then I started preaching, actually, when I was 13. And I started filling pulpits when I was 16. Just to give you a sense of this, my teammates in lacrosse and football called me Padre. And might give you an idea of the fact that I was preaching all the time. If I were to show you the Bible that I used from those days, Robin can attest to this, that there's just, it's just full of notes and all these kinds of things all over the place. And I was actually teaching myself Greek at that time when I was 16. But, there was a compulsion of the Spirit here, is I guess the bottom line here. Yes, I did go to church, but the connection between Francis Schaeffer and a biblical view of how do I interact in the world was really where I was coming from. And having read or reading his books when I was in high school was really kind of the biggest turning point in my life.
You mentioned about this not necessarily being a Christian nation. I think that's always when people say that, it's always kind of bothered me, because a lot of times you hear about people who probably say they're Christians but have nothing to do with the church.
Yeah.
And it's kind of, you know, held together with kind of nationalism. And I don't want to use that, I know that's a political word these days, but people that know all things for the country view that as being Christian, but it's different. So I appreciate you saying that.
Sure. Just to reiterate again, the importance of the influence of Christianity on the American system, the whole system. For a snapshot of this, the three branches of government actually comes out of the Swiss Constitution of about 1575, which was thoroughly Christian. And the reason why goes back to the two pillars again. You put power in the hands of many because you don't trust anybody. You don't trust judicial, legislative, or executive on their own. You give broad powers to all three so that they give, wait for it here, it's very clear, checks and balances. So we actually live in a nation built upon these Christian principles. Now there's not chapter and verse in the Constitution, but there's a thoroughgoing understanding of Leviticus and Deuteronomy in those pages. But we were not ever established as a Christian nation. So both of those things at the same time. Thanks for letting me put an exclamation point on that. Thanks everybody for being here. See you next week.